Have you ever wondered what a scientific explanation for the bending in Avatar: The Last Airbender would be? Or why the different elements in bending work the way they do? What theories would a scientist suggest to explain the connections between the elements and their connection to spirit? I'm confident that my explanation will make sense, and bonus, it's going to help you revise the types of chemical bonding that occur in matter, as well as the states of matter, and a little bit about the fundamental model of the universe, but that's less important than figuring out which element is your favourite and why. I still can't choose. After all these years since I first watched the show, I cannot decide my favourite. They're all so powerful, but my theory is that a powerful enough bender, not necessarily the Avatar, could interact with all the elements, and the separation between them, like Iroh says, truly is just an illusion. It all comes down to electrons and chemical bonds. So here's why I think if you are a bender and you were gifted enough, you could bend all four elements no problem and achieve the same spiritual enlightenment as the Avatar. But before I get carried away and forget to do my intro, welcome back to my series GCSE Minecraft and Chill, where I talk about whatever interests me related to a GCSE maths and science topic, while I also play a bit of Minecraft to entertain myself and maybe you. I hope your evening so far is cozy and warm, and that you've got a drink and something to do while I chat at you, and you're going to have to bear with me on this one because I am so excited. If you saw my earlier chemistry video in this series, you already know that I'm into alchemy, I'm into elements, I'm into sci-fi and fantasy and spiritual stuff, and we can tell that my last video was sort of similar to this one with a physics explanation for the Force in Star Wars, but Avatar: The Last Airbender was a huge deal for me as a millennial kid. I was just super into this concept of the four elements of nature. It tied into my interest in alchemy, and when I learned about the actual elements of matter at school, I was a bit confused. I was like, what's going on here? Earth, water, air, fire are all still real. They're still like the fundamental elements of matter in nature, so what's going on? Well, I'm not exactly going to turn this into a super philosophical video. We don't have time to go into like detail into anything really, but what is happening here is that there's a difference between the physical material elements of matter as we define them and the symbolic elements of nature and the interactions of matter and states, but they are of course connected, and it's actually kind of interesting how they are, and it forms the basis really of my theory for how bending works. First, I'm going to define what I actually mean by matter. We're going to have to do a small little teeny tiny foray into physics just briefly. If you watched last week's physics video, you'll be all caught up for this, but we currently have the particle model of matter. It's called the Standard Model, you've probably heard of it, where every atom, all of the matter in the universe, and all of the forces that we know about are made up of subatomic particles called quarks, leptons, and bosons. And the main issue with this model is that unfortunately it can't currently explain a few things. It doesn't explain everything, particularly famously gravity, but also things like dark energy and certain aspects of matter and the nature of our universe. And that's exciting to me. It's also just dubious enough to give science fiction and fantasy writers a whole space for imagination and theorizing for the sake of creative expression, and I love that. I hope that the universe always has mysteries for us, that we never fully have everything explained, which might be a bit controversial as a scientist to say. I don't know. I also love discovering the mysteries. I just never want that discovery to end, you know? You see what I mean? Anyway, we have our particles of matter and the force particles that act on that matter. Matter in this model means the subset of particles that have mass, that are distinct from what we can measure or call pure energy. So forces act on matter when there's enough energy transferred or potentially able to do enough work to make something happen, right? We call it work. And that creates an imbalance that gives us a resultant force. And there are four fundamental forces: the strong and weak nuclear forces, the electromagnetic force, and gravity, and we're only going to talk about those last two today. So the electromagnetic force is the star of the show, and it is the most relevant one in chemistry in general. So while this episode is sort of going to stray a little bit between the boundaries of chemistry and physics, we are now squarely, our feet are back on the chemistry side of the line. The electromagnetic force acts on charged particles, which includes protons and electrons that you're familiar with, as well as other particles. So inside an atom, the particles are the proton, the neutron, and the electron. Atoms are made up of fermions, which means that they are not bosons. Bosons are force particles. Fermions are all of the matter particles that we're familiar with. So we have protons, neutrons, which are made up of quarks, and the electron, which is a negatively charged lepton. The proton and neutron have a much larger mass than the electron, and the proton has a positive charge while the neutron has a neutral or no charge. So the proton and neutron cluster in the center of the atom in the nucleus, while the electrons orbit around in shells or layers, each with distinct different amounts of potential electromagnetic energy, which bonds them to the nucleus, like the moon locked in orbit from Earth's gravitational potential energy well. This orbital nature of the electrons, locked into orbit by this electromagnetic potential energy well, is what determines all chemical reactions and interactions. The most stable form of an atom, of course, is the full shell, which, other than the very first shell, which holds 2 electrons, usually we're talking about a total of 8 electrons. So the push and pull between atoms with the different baseline numbers of electrons in their outermost shell either is trying to repel electrons to empty their shell, or attract a few electrons to fill their outer shell, which is what gives rise to all chemical compounds and the 3 types of bonding that we have: ionic, metallic, and covalent. So I'm going to quickly recap these as well. We're getting a lot of revision. These episodes aren't usually so revision or theory heavy, but there we are. So ionic bonding happens when one atom loses or gets rid of its electrons, becoming positively charged, and another gains electrons and becomes negatively charged. And then these opposing positive and negative charges electrostatically stick together. This type of bond forms things like salts, ionic solids like ceramics, and pretty much all rocks. Covalent bonding is sort of the natural opposite of this electrostatic sticking together, where instead of losing or gaining any electrons completely, the atoms share their outermost shell. They sort of become entangled, and we call that shell the valence shell, hence covalent, and they share their outermost electrons in order to each have a full shell overall. Covalent compounds tend to be, because of this overlapping, very strongly stuck together and can either create giant tough structures like diamond, or tiny isolated compound molecules that form gases, where each of these individual molecules all stay separate from one another, just happily bonded together on their own. Metallic bonding is sort of the intermediate. It's when metal atoms delocalize their electrons to sort of take a halfway compromise between the ionic and covalent bonding extremes, where each metallic atom is stuck near all of the others around it so that they can all communally have electrons whiz around, not fully losing them, but not fully sharing their outer orbitals either. So there you have it. Ionic, covalent, and metallic bonding are 3 types of intramolecular bonding. This means that the bonding is occurring within or between individual molecules. So it's referring to the bond being within the overall molecular structure. But we have this other type of bonding called intermolecular bonding, which refers to the temporary, or sometimes we call them instantaneous, bonds. You'll have heard other names for them, like Van der Waals forces, all these other kinds of names for them. What matters is that they are between separate molecules, and they happen because of the constant movement of charge of the electrons. So imagine electrons whizzing around like the moon and the earth. Sometimes different electrons in different molecules will align and repel each other, and sometimes they cluster at different ends of a molecule and can orient themselves like little magnets and stick together, forming a temporary instantaneous bond. So that's intermolecular bonding, whereas the ionic, covalent, metallic, that's intramolecular. And we're going to talk a little bit about both in terms of my theory, but keep in mind always that we're talking about electromagnetic forces. These forces involved in chemical bonds determine the types of chemical reactions that happen. They determine the status of matter and the nature of any material you interact with. It's going to come down to electromagnetic forces. The states of matter is also relevant to this conversation, so let's revise that quickly. We've got solid, liquid, gas, commonly, especially when you first learn about them at school, but of course we have other states of matter too. We've got plasma, super solid, super states, all sorts of weirdness at extremely high or low temperatures or densities or whatever. So we're going to just focus on the main 3, the boring 3. So solid represents the strongest bonds and the densest form of the 3, whereas gas represents, of course, the weakest intermolecular bonds and the least dense of the 3, whereas liquid is this sort of goopy intermediate mid-strength intermolecular bond. It takes energy to break these bonds and separate a solid to make those bonds loose enough to form a liquid, and it takes even more energy to break those bonds and make the molecules completely separate to form a gas, right? You might start to be piecing together where this is going now. The energy that we use to break bonds is usually heat energy, and we're all familiar with the concepts of melting, boiling, and the reverse processes, condensing, freezing. While we typically will associate and measure the strengths of these bonds with heat and thermal energies, it is possible to break these bonds with other energies and other forces. And I actually found a really great article going through some of the physics involved in bending when gathering some material for this video, which has some different ideas than what I'm talking about here, but they are all very good and fantastic theories and explain the physical mechanics pretty clearly. So if you're interested in the premise of this video, go check it out. Link is going to be, of course, whether you all the resources usually are. You know the drill. Whereas I'm going to be focusing on the states of matter and the chemical bonds in the different elements, and focus less on the physical mechanics of bending and more on the sort of underlying chemical theory. Let's talk about bending more now that you know all the basics and we're caught up on all the chemistry and physics we need to know to get into it. It's time for the elements. First, of course, naturally, we're going to start with Earth. Element of stability, life, solidity of matter. In Avatar, the Earthbenders can lift, move, break, smash, and seemingly liquefy and move Earth like putty according to their whims. And specifically, Earthbenders focus on the manipulation of rock matter, which is a sort of muddy boundary, pun intended, as it is established up until it isn't, that metal doesn't count as Earth, but sand does, while mud doesn't, but maybe it sort of does because it's water and earth, whereas soil is mostly indistinguishable from earth, but we never really see soil bending, and magma and lava only all count as earth bending if you're also a firebender. So what is going on? It seems based on this, the world of Avatar is defining Earth as strictly the material making up the rocky lithospheric crust of the planet, and that the limits of the size of the rocky particles an individual bender can manipulate depends on their personal finesse and bending strengths, because sand is just very tiny rock particles, and mud even smaller. But it is suggested that you have to have a particular skill to easily sand bend, whereas soil might just be too made up of organic matter, and mud, maybe the particles are just too small and it contains too much water, and metal is too pure. Although, obviously, this is eventually overcome with the intense skill of probably the greatest earthbender in the entire canon, who revolutionized the field of earthbending and was able to metal bend. So that does give a kind of clear logic to what we're defining earthbending as. And before I digress and make this too much of an ode to Toph, what I'm getting at is that it is clear to me that earthbending corresponds to ionic bonds. Earth, in this case meaning rocks, are all composed of mainly aluminosilicate crystal material, among a few other compounds, that form repeating ionic lattices. That's the vast majority of all the chemical bonds in rocks and crystals. So to break a rock into smaller pieces, the earthbender must be breaking ionic bonds and can recombine them at will. Impressive. And the stronger the bender is, the more able to tap into the impurities and repeating lattice structure of a metal that they are. They can even manipulate some extent of metallic bonding. And though it's suggested that the more pure and more metallic, or when certain metals are used, the substance could then be immune to even metal bending, it does seem that there is this, that would suggest to me, because we're not distinguishing earthbending as just the elements of the earth, it's specifically about the ionic bonds, and the more pure and the less ionic and the more metallic your metal is going to actually be, the less earthbenders are able to bend it, even if they can do metal bending. So fascinating stuff, right? Anyway, on to Earth's elemental opposite, air. The element of lightness, of void, of agility, mutability, and quick thinking. Airbenders have a really impressive array of skills in Avatar, though we tend to see more of them in the Legend of Korra series as opposed to the Legend of Aang, which is a shame. The airbender can create strong pressure gradients, gathers air molecules together, directs them, and levitates upon them. What this indicates to me is a direct manipulation of the intermolecular bonds between individual gas molecules, with a natural affinity, it seems, for the spaces in between matter, and motion generally as well. It's easy to see why that then puts air as Earth's natural opposite. There are two particularly interesting traits associated with air, alongside what I just mentioned, which was cool enough, that I want to focus on though, and that's this affinity for the spaces between matter, the movement of matter, and ability to move with or control the movement of intermolecular bonds, because that is what seems to connect advanced airbenders to gravity, and that so many airbenders tend to have a strong connection to the spirit world, to astral projection, to spirit creatures. These two things might not seem connected at first, but they've always made absolute sense to me, because gravity is related to mass, to the force that connects matter together, seeking always to decrease the space between massive particles. And it's funny to me that the four natural elements, as told in Avatar The Last Airbender, can include within its logic the secrets of gravity in a way that the standard model of physics does not. But I'm just being silly. There's also a larger picture of the element of air being connected to spirit, the fifth element, ether, which is also known as the void element. And this is why so many airbenders are so spiritual, so detached from the material world and literally material concerns. This is why Zahir in the Legend of Korra was able to detach from the space-decreasing forces of gravity and simply float, not in the same way an airbender levitates, but in a way where there ceases to be a pull on his mass towards the strongest gravitational potential well acting on him. So air is about the spaces between molecules and the forces that attach or detach them, bond and separate them. Incredible. Now water, the element of change, of flow, of healing and emotions, the literal substance of flow and solvent for all chemical reactions required for life on Earth, sustaining us, similar to how sunlight does, and just as necessary. It is the element of community and cohesion as a sort of, dare I say, denser version of airbending. I do dare say, in fact, I dare even further by not just implying but outright saying that yes, the bonds that hold water together in its liquidy state are just intermolecular bonds with a higher density than the intermolecular bonds involved in gases. They are a special type of intermolecular bond, though, called hydrogen bonds, because of the two hydrogens on water's atoms bonded to an oxygen that steals all the electrons away from the hydrogens, and it creates a more sort of semi-permanent effect of the electrons whizzing around that I was talking about a minute ago. So this creates the ability for water molecules to stick together and requires even more energy to separate them, which is what gives us the viscous, dense fluid that we're all familiar with. So waterbenders can manipulate these intermolecular hydrogen bonds at will, also able to create motion, separate clusters of molecules, and influence the water even when it isn't pure, like how earthbenders have that problem because of ionic bonds. Waterbenders don't. They can heal wounds, they can blood bend, they can plant bend. It all comes naturally to them because it's just about the motion, the push and pull, the connections and bonds. And that's going to be intermolecular hydrogen bonds regardless of the purity of the watery liquid, which I think is why Katara is able to mud bend as well. Waterbenders that are particularly gifted also have the ability to, like, not just readily but instantaneously change the state of water as well, turning it to ice and back to water whenever they want, demonstrating a high level of control of the internal thermal energy of the system, apparently, or perhaps just the strength of the intermolecular bonds determining the state. But we rarely ever see that progress into steam, which I find particularly interesting. Is that hinting at some sort of energetic limit to a waterbender's ability, or implying that the solid and liquid nature of the intermolecular bonds is completely fine to manipulate, since the bonds are still present and connected to a degree, or just determining how strong that bond is? But steam would represent a complete separation and breaking of those bonds, and waterbenders simply don't have that ability because it's focused on the connection and focused on the bonds, the intermolecular bonds. This is interesting stuff, right? So that naturally leads me on to firebending, which is the element of energy, of heat, light, action, externalization, and destruction. Like earth and water are about connection and attachment, air and fire are more about separation and release. Fire seems to be the only element less focused on matter and solely focused on energy. That makes it a standout, odd one out element to me, which definitely fits the narrative of the show of how the firebenders ended up so spiritually astray compared to other benders and nations that did seem more focused on unity. Electrochemically speaking, physically speaking, fire must be all about electrons and thermal energy. We have the evidence for the thermal energy part, that's obvious, but the fact that specifically most firebending manifests as flames is interesting because that represents a specific combustion reaction of elements in oxygen, in air, connecting it to that element. We know two other useful things. One, that lightning bending is an aspect of firebending, which is purely about electric potential energy, or electromagnetic, electrostatic bonds, energies, forces, all of that stuff. And two, that there are myriad ways that the element of fire and energy can be used. We can have a rainbow of flames that represent not just burning in air, or organic matter burning in air, but other matter potentially visually indicating to us plasma states or other ionic type energies being released. What I take away from that is that fire seems to be about the energies of all of the types of bonds. We know that firebending can apply thermal energy to any of the other elements, to any matter at all, and specifically that electrons can be manipulated, primarily through separating them to create an electric potential that would release a lightning strike, which means it isn't a stretch to say that firebending is really about the bender having a pure access to energies required to separate bonds that hold matter together, including electrons. It's fitting then that the Fire Nation is the one that started the war that separated all the nations, right? And if this just doesn't all collapse together in a unified theory of the elements for you, I have a few final summary points for your consideration. In my view, none of the bending seems to correlate to nuclear forces between particles of matter, only electromagnetic and gravitational. There is some connection between the way that bending interacts with electrons via intermolecular bonds, electrostatic potentials, ionic bonds, and the way that bending is all about energy, imparting, releasing, supplying, and manipulating the energy of matter, connecting it to gravity and kinetic and thermal energies. All forms of bending defy gravity in a way that kinetic energy is supplied to lift and move the elements around. Furthermore, and another thing, there are these themes of bonding, connection, mass, matter, spirit, detachment, separation, all suggesting some sort of unified model of reality that is accessible to benders who understand the flow of energies through, around, and between matter, which enables them to also spirit bend, to tap and tune into energy supernaturally. Particularly the airbenders are gifted at this, being the element most naturally inclined towards the concepts of separateness of bonds and matter, and of energy, the energy in the space between matter. And finally, just like my absolute favourite Uncle Iroh says, the separation between the elements is an illusion. They are all connected, and that understanding is what makes the Avatar so powerful. And what made Aang in particular so uniquely powerful is that he managed to take that understanding a step further to his emotional and spiritual connections, and he understood that he was not separate to anyone else. Nobody is. So it's all about connections, and if you're scientifically minded, you'd say, yes, intermolecular, energetic connections. If you're spiritually minded, you might say community connections. Either way, in other words, bending is all about bonding. Thank you for watching, everyone, and while we cannot bend unless we use some fancy expensive equipment to manipulate electrons, I still believe that our words are spells, so always be kind to yourself, stay connected and bonded to your community. Have a lovely rest of your day. I'll see you next time. Yalla bye.